Disclaimer. This video is created strictly for educational and informational purposes only. It contains discussions or depictions of sensitive topics that may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. A young father is found on a rural bridge in the middle of the night, bleeding from a single gunshot wound to his back. He is barely conscious. By the time doctors get him to surgery, the bullet has already torn through his heart. He does not survive. Investigators do not have to look far for a motive. His ex-fiancée had been fighting him in court for months, trying to stop him from getting time with their own daughter. But what they eventually uncover is not a single person acting alone in a moment of rage. It is a high school softball coach who recruited her own players, teenagers she had spent years training and mentoring to help her plan and carry out his murder. This is the case of Shea Briar, a case that would eventually become the subject of a CBS 48 Hours investigation titled Coached to Kill, because of exactly how literally that title applies. This video covers a real murder conspiracy involving a minor as an accomplice. Viewer discretion is advised. What makes this case so unsettling is not just the violence itself, but the position of trust that made it possible in the first place. A softball program exists to build young athletes up, teach them discipline, and give them a mentor they can rely on. In this case, that exact same structure of trust became the recruiting ground for a murder plot. Shea Michael Briar is born March 9, 1988 at Ball Memorial Hospital in Muncie, Indiana, to Tracy Chalfant Briar and Robert Hovell. He grows up between two very different worlds, born in Indiana, but largely raised in Hawaii by his mother and stepfather alongside his sister Sydney. His mother, Tracy Hovell, would later describe him to CBS's 48 Hours in the kind of small, affectionate detail that says everything about a childhood. A little rascal, she calls him, laughing at the memory, very polite, always opening doors for people, and completely devoted to his G. Joe's as a kid, as an adult. Shea serves in the Navy before eventually making his way back to Jay County, Indiana, the rural farming community where detectives would later say almost nothing ever happens. He settles in the small city of Portland, Indiana, and by all accounts, builds the kind of steady, quiet life a farming community like this one is built around. Faith becomes a defining part of Shea's adult life. Pastor Angela Smiley of his local church would later describe him as the most reliable person in the congregation, the first one there every single week without fail. On the night of January 11th, 2020, the two of them served together at a noodle dinner at the church. Smiley recalls watching Shea walk the older women in the congregation out to their cars afterward, as he always did. His last words to her that night are almost unbearably ordinary in hindsight. "I'll beat you here in the morning," he tells her, referring to the next day's service. Shea is 31 years old at the time and the father of a young daughter he shares with his ex-fiancée, 31-year-old Esther E.J Stephen, who goes by EJ. The two had been engaged following their daughter's birth in January 2019, but the relationship ends near the close of that same year. What follows is not a quiet separation. Shea and Stephen enter into a disagreement over custody and parenting time, serious enough that in November 2019, Shea files a legal petition to formally establish paternity and seek custody and parenting time with his own daughter. None of that legal paperwork reads as unusual on its own. Plenty of separated parents end up working through custody arrangements in family court every year. What almost nobody around Shea fully grasps at the time is the position Stephen occupies in her own community, and just how far she is willing to go to make sure that custody fight never proceeds any further. EJ. Stephen is the head softball coach at Fort Recovery High School, just across the state line in Ohio. It is a position of trust and influence in a small community, the kind of role that puts a coach in close contact with teenage girls for years at a time, building relationships built on mentorship, respect, and in some cases, genuine loyalty. One of those players is 18-year-old Shelby Hiestand, a former player on Stephen's team who by January 2020 has become her assistant coach. According to court records and testimony later presented at trial, the plot against Shea Briar does not begin the night he is killed. It begins months earlier, growing directly out of Stephen's anger over losing exclusive control of their daughter. Detectives would later describe how Stephen used the trust built through years of coaching to recruit not one but two young women into her plan, Shelby Hiestand and another player named Hannah Napke. A woman named Christy Cibre, a former police officer and acquaintance of Stephen's, becomes an important early source for investigators after the murder. Cibre tells detectives that in the months leading up to Shea's death, Stephen came over to her house, often accompanied by Hiestand, and that during those visits, Stephen would confide in her about problems with Shea. According to Cibre, it came down to something simple and possessive. Stephen did not want to share the baby. That was her baby. The plot does not begin with a gun. Prosecutors say Stephen first attempts to kill Shea in a far less direct way, by lacing a drink with crushed ibuprofen pills. When later questioned about that incident, Stephen would claim to investigators it had actually been part of a chemistry experiment, an explanation detectives do not find credible given everything else they uncover. As the failed poisoning attempt fades and the custody case in family court continues moving forward, the plan escalates towards something far more direct. Text messages recovered by investigators show just how far the intent had progressed a full month before the murder. In one message, Hiestand writes to Stephen, "I'm killing that bastard with my own two hands." Language investigators would later point to directly as evidence this was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but something being actively discussed and planned, well in advance. In the weeks before the murder, Stephen and Hiestand physically scout a location together, a remote bridge along J County Road 125 West near County Road 850 North, chosen specifically for how isolated it is. They also take the added step of test firing the weapon they intend to use, a .22 caliber rifle, in a church parking lot beforehand to make sure it functions properly when the moment comes. Hannah Napke's role in the plan is more logistical than physical. Court documents describe her helping secure the murder weapon itself from Hiestand's home, along with ammunition, and later providing the vehicle the group would use on the night of the murder. 3 young women, each carrying a separate piece of the same plan, converge around a decision that had, by this point, moved well past any single angry outburst. On the evening of January 11th, 2020, Stephen drops her young daughter off at Christy Cibre's house, securing a babysitter that frees up her entire night. Around midnight, Stephen calls Shea. She does not tell him what is actually planned. She simply asks him for a ride. What stands out most clearly once the full timeline comes together at trial is how much distance existed between the first failed attempt on Shea's life and the night he was actually killed. This was not a plan assembled in a single burst of anger. It stretched across months. A poisoning attempt that failed a custody case that kept moving forward in family court despite Stephen's efforts to stop it, and a slow escalating conversation among 3 young women about what it would actually take to make the problem disappear for good. Investigators would later point to that extended timeline specifically as evidence undermining any claim that this was a spontaneous or impulsive act by anyone involved. Shea agrees. According to court records, Stephen and Hiestand meet him, and the 3 of them drive together to the isolated bridge on County Road 125 West, the same location Stephen and Hiestand had scouted in advance. There is no indication in the record that Shea has any idea what is actually happening. As far as he understands it, he is simply giving his ex-fiancée a ride somewhere late at night. Once they reach the bridge, Stephen distracts Shea according to court testimony, while Hiestand raises the rifle they had test-fired days earlier in that church parking lot and shoots him once in the back dot. The bullet enters Shea's back and travels directly through his heart, passing through the left atrium, the left ventricle, and the septum, according to the autopsy later presented at trial. There is no exit wound. The bullet simply stays lodged inside him. What happens immediately afterward is, if anything, even harder to reconcile than the shooting itself. Rather than call for help, Stephen throws Shea's phone into the river beneath the bridge, specifically to prevent him from being able to reach anyone. He is left on that remote rural roadway bleeding in the cold January night with no way to call for help and no way for anyone to know where he is. Shea is not found immediately. He lies on that bridge for a period of time before eventually being discovered, lying on his back, fading in and out of consciousness with abrasions and minor bleeding visible on his arms and hands. He is transported first to a hospital in Decatur before being moved to a larger facility in Fort Wayne, where doctors work to save him. It is not enough. The damage to his heart is too severe, and Shea dies from his wound. Detective Ben Schwartz would later describe the medical detail that made this wound so devastating in blunt terms to 48 Hours correspondent Anne-Marie Green. There was no exit wound. The bullet stayed lodged directly inside his heart. For a wound that small and contained in a single entry point, the internal damage it caused was catastrophic enough that even rapid transport to 2 separate hospitals could not save him. It is the kind of detail that underscores just how little chance Shea ever had once Hiestand pulled that trigger on the bridge. The first sign anything is wrong does not come from a phone call or a police report. It comes from an empty parking space at a small Jay County church. Pastor Angela Smiley notices immediately that Sunday morning that Shea's truck is not there. And given how reliably early he always was, every single week, without exception, she knows instantly that something is deeply wrong. Word moves quickly through a small rural community like this one. Shea's aunt Tiffany McLaughlin and his grandmother Sharon Taylor hear he is missing and immediately begin trying to track him down themselves. Taylor later describes calling every hospital and every sheriff's department she can think of, only to be told again and again that nobody could give her any information. It is only when Shea's roommate calls McLaughlin to say police are at their home that the family finally understands something has happened. For investigators, the case presents its own immediate challenge. Detective Ben Schwartz of the Jay County Sheriff's Department would later describe this as a very rural farming community. Not the kind of place used to back-to-back major crime calls the way a big city might be. As soon as word of the shooting spreads, it becomes what he calls a pretty big deal for the entire county specifically, because the location where Shea was found is so isolated that investigators are left asking a basic logistical question before anything else: how did he even get all the way out there? At this stage, detectives have almost nothing beyond the physical scene itself. No witnesses at the bridge, no security cameras on a remote rural road. Schwartz would later summarize the state of the investigation in those first hours in blunt terms: they had to start from ground zero, which meant digging into every detail of who Shea Briar actually was and what he had been dealing with in the life, months before his death. That digging leads investigators almost immediately toward the custody dispute and toward the woman on the other side of it. For a community this small, the not knowing becomes its own kind of weight in those first 2 days. Shea's family is left making phone call after phone call to hospitals and sheriff's departments, getting nothing but silence in return. While somewhere across the county, 2 of the people responsible for what happened to him are going about their normal lives. One of them still scheduled to coach a team of teenage girls who have no idea what their coach has just done. The break in the case comes just as it often does in cases like this one, through someone close to the people involved deciding they cannot stay silent. Christy Sibre, the family acquaintance and former police officer who had watched Stephen confide in her for months about her frustration over the custody case, reaches out to detectives directly. She tells them about Stephen's visits, about Hiestand's presence at those visits, and about Stephen's repeated insistence that she was not going to share the baby. A day after speaking with Sibre, detectives bring both Stephen and Hiestand in for questioning. What follows becomes one of the central pieces of evidence at trial. Recorded interrogations in which both women eventually make admissions, connecting them directly to the murder. During Hiestand's own recorded statement to police, she first confirms she can read and write by reading aloud the first line of her rights advisement form before acknowledging she understood those rights. What she says afterward in that same interview becomes part of the evidentiary record used against her at trial. Detectives methodically build out the rest of the case from there. Phone records place Stephen in contact with Shea in the hours before he was found, placing her directly at the center of his final movements that night. Witness testimony from people close to both young women describes prior conversations about wanting to harm him, including the text message from Hiestand describing killing him with her own 2 hands. And the recovered rifle itself, along with the recorded test firing in the church parking lot, ties the physical murder weapon directly back to the plan investigators are now piecing together. On January 14, 2020, just 2 days after Shea was found, the Jay County Prosecutor's Office announces the arrests of both Stephen and Hiestand. Both are held without bond at the Jay County Security Center. The Fort Recovery School District immediately places both women on administrative leave from their coaching positions, barring them from any contact with students while the investigation continues. A third young woman, Hannah Kanapke, is later charged as well for her role helping secure the weapon and the vehicle used that night. The scale of what detectives have uncovered, a head coach and her own assistant coach, a former player on that same team working together to kill the coach's ex-fiancée, sends shockwaves through both the Fort Recovery and Jay County communities. This is not simply a domestic dispute that escalated between 2 adults. It is a case that pulls a girls' high school softball program and the trust built inside it directly into a murder investigation. Parents of players on that same team are left grappling with a particularly disturbing realization. The same woman who had spent seasons coaching and mentoring their daughters had also spent those same months recruiting one of those daughters into a murder plot. Fort Recovery School officials move quickly to restrict any contact between either coach and current students as the investigation unfolds. But for a small athletic program built on trust between coach and player, the damage to that sense of safety cannot be undone by an administrative leave notice alone. As the case moves toward trial, the detail that reframes everything for the public is not a single piece of forensic evidence. It is the full scope of how Stephen used her position as a coach to make this plan possible in the first place. Detectives noted specifically how much influence Stephen held over the younger women in her circle, using the trust built through years of coaching relationships to bring them into a murder conspiracy most adults would never have been able to recruit. A teenager into on their own. This is a dynamic 48 hours would go on to explore in significant depth once the case reaches national television in 2026. The question of how a trusted adult figure in a young person's life is able to convert that trust into complicity in something as serious as murder. It is not a question with a comfortable answer, and it is part of why this case continued generating headlines and appeals for years after both original verdicts were handed down. At trial, Stephen's defense would attempt to reframe her role in different terms, but prosecutors lay out a case built on a woman who methodically recruited, resourced, planned, and orchestrated every stage of the killing while never personally pulling the trigger herself. It is Hiestand at 18 years old who fires the fatal shot. It is Stephen who chose the location, tested the weapon, secured the babysitter, and made the call that lured Shea to that bridge in the first place. One detail stands out specifically at Hiestand's later sentencing. Her own defense had insinuated during the case that she had effectively been groomed by Stephen, a coach with authority over her manipulating a teenage former player into carrying out a murder. J Circuit Court Judge Brian Hutchison addresses that claim directly from the bench, stating plainly that although grooming had been insinuated, no actual evidence had been presented to support it. It is a distinction the court draws carefully, acknowledging the obvious power imbalance between a 31-year-old coach and her 18-year-old assistant, while still holding Hiestand fully responsible under the law for pulling the trigger, herself. The twist that lingers longest for anyone following this case is not a hidden killer or an unexpected suspect. It is the uncomfortable reality that a role built entirely around mentoring and protecting young athletes, a high school softball program, became the exact structure Stephen used to recruit the help she needed to kill the father of her own child. There is a second layer to this same twist worth sitting with. The custody fight that started all of it was never really about anything unusual or extreme on Shea's side. He was not seeking to take his daughter away from her mother. Court records describe him simply asking for parenting time and to establish paternity, the most ordinary request a separated father can make. It was the ordinariness of that request, set against the extremity of Stephen's response, that investigators and later the jury found so difficult to reconcile. A reasonable custody dispute met with a murder conspiracy is not a proportional response by any legal or human measure, and that imbalance becomes central to how prosecutors frame Stephen's culpability at trial. Esther Jane Stephen stands trial first. Following a 5-day trial in March 2021, a J Circuit Court jury finds her guilty of murder. In May 2021, she is sentenced to 55 years in prison, the advisory sentence under Indiana law for murder, which carries a range of 45 to 65 years. On appeal, Stephen argues the evidence did not support her conviction and that she deserved a shorter sentence. In November 2021, a 3-judge appellate panel unanimously rejects that argument. Judge Elizabeth Tavitos writes in the ruling that despite having no prior criminal record, Stephen organized Briar's killing with the depravity of a hardened criminal, undeterred by second thoughts. Shelby Hiestand is convicted of murder in August 2021 and sentenced that September also to 55 years. At her sentencing hearing, Shea's family speaks directly to her. His aunt Tiffany McLaughlin tells the court, Shea is her first thought every morning and her last thought every night, sometimes returning to her mind throughout the entire day. She looks at Hiestand directly and tells her you knew what you were doing, but you still pulled the trigger. Shea's grandmother, Sharon Taylor, quotes scripture before telling Hiestand plainly, Shea is dead. You murdered him, Shelby. You watched Shea struggle to live. You murdered him. Hiestand cries throughout both statements. Hannah Napke's case resolves differently. Rather than face trial for murder, she pleads guilty to voluntary manslaughter for her role, helping secure the weapon and the vehicle. She receives a reduced sentence of 17.5 years, a significant departure from the 55-year terms handed to Stephen and Hiestand, reflecting her more limited logistical role in the plan compared to the 2 women directly present at the bridge that night. In the years since sentencing, both Stephen and Hiestand have continued to challenge their convictions through the appellate system. As recently as 2025, a J Circuit Court judge denied a post-conviction relief request from Stephen, alleging various violations of her constitutional rights during questioning and at trial. The latest in a series of rulings that have consistently upheld the original verdicts against both women. Shea's mother, Tracy Hovell, summarized what the years since his death have actually meant for the family left behind in a single sentence delivered at one of the sentencing hearings. Their family had gone through hell since Shea was shot in the back, and left to die in the road. In January 2026, CBS's 48 Hours revisits the entire case in an episode titled Coach to Kill, bringing renewed public attention to a story that had, for the people who actually lived through it, never really faded at all. Shea Briar was 31 years old. He left behind a young daughter he had only been trying to see. Jay County prosecutor Wes Skemenor, who oversaw the case from the earliest arrests through both trials, would later reflect on the sentencing outcomes in terms that acknowledge just how much weight this case carried for the community that lived through it. Speaking after Hiestand's sentencing, he said he believed the judge had ultimately reached the right conclusion, adding that in deference to Shea's family and everything they had lost, the aggravating circumstances in this case clearly outweighed anything that could be said in mitigation. It was, he said, simply a brutal and heinous situation. What began as an ordinary custody filing in November 2019, a father asking a court for nothing more than the chance to see his own daughter, ended 14 months later with that same father buried and 3 young women who once shared a softball dugout together now serving out decades behind bars for his murder. Fort Recovery, Indiana, and the surrounding Jay County community continue carrying the weight of what happened on that bridge years later. Every time the case resurfaces in a headline, an appeal, or now a primetime television episode revisiting it for a national audience.